my name is Redmond Taggart. I'm living here in South Africa, but the way I fit in is that my great-great-uncle was William James Pirrie, which means that his sister was my great-grandmother, and Thomas Andrews was my great-uncle. His sister was my grandmother. So that's basically how I fit into the picture. Funny enough, the Titanic and the Titanic story was never very much discussed in the family. And much later, when we were at the celebration of the launch of the Titanic, the then head of the family, John Andrews, who was Thomas Andrews' nephew, he was almost reluctant to be part of it because they, for some reason, felt ashamed about the whole lot. But as I think everybody now knows, there was nothing wrong with the construction of that ship. Thomas Andrews was born in 1873. At the age of 16, he left school and was apprenticed to Holland and Wolff. Now in those days, and quite a long time afterwards, there was a very long apprenticeship, even though he was a management apprentice. So to learn everything, he went to every single shop, every single part of the construction. And this process took 6 years. Thomas Andrews was very much involved in the design of these ships. Now, in those days, the major tool of calculation was a slide rule. The accurate one's been done by the 7-figure logs. This is a very simple but extremely useful calculating machine, or calculating instrument, which was only replaced when sophisticated calculators came along, and that was really in the late 1970s. They decided to go ahead with the 3 ships, and Thomas Andrews, and in fact the main designer, was a sort of uncle-in-law. And in those days it was considered it had to be the best man for the job. So it just so happened that the best man for the job, the chief designer, Alexander Carlyle, was Pirrie's brother-in-law. And the head of the design office was his nephew. William James Pirrie had managed to convince Esme to build 3 super ships. They were absolutely huge. They were pushing the levels of the current technology to unbelievable extents. So the first thing they had to do is to build these huge gantries, which they could build the 2 ships at the same time. The Olympic was, of course, the first one to be launched. And one always sort of has heard about the Titanic as the biggest and the best. Esme had insisted that the upper decks of the Titanic were enclosed because the experience of the Olympic is that it had been a little bit prone to spray and all that sort of stuff. But other than that, the ships were pretty well identical. You can imagine the difficulty in constructing these ships. You got huge steel plates, probably about 1/4 of an inch thick, and these had to be cut. Then they had to be bent to the right shape, which was mainly done by things like sledgehammers and hammers on a mold. And then from there, they had to be transported to where the ships were. It then goes into the right place in the ships, and then they were riveted together. For the more easier stuff, they had an automatic riveting device. But the Titanic had all sorts of curves and things, which was relatively unusual in those days. And when there was difficult places, it was impossible to use the automatic riveter. So the rivets had to be done by hand, which was a huge skill. And because of that, the riveters, in fact, were the prime workers. Certainly in those days, there was no health and safety regulations like we have today. It came about 3 years of intensive work, and then took a year fitting out. So at the time of the Titanic launching, the Olympic was already operational. Captain Smith, he had risen up through the ranks from sailing ships and all sorts of things, and was an absolute master at controlling these big ships, and bearing in mind that the Olympic was again much bigger than any other ship in the world. However, he treated them as if they were a little sports car, and he did cut corners, and unfortunately every now and then there was a little bit of an oops. So he was a little bit of a cowboy, but he was so good he was allowed to get away with it. Unfortunately with the Olympic, at one time leaving Southampton, there was a ship coming the other way called HMS Hawke, which was an obsolescent cruiser. So the two ships were passing side by side. The commander got a little bit worried about the fact that it was a bit close and managed to ram the Olympic towards its stern, damaging its main shaft. I don't think anybody in those days realized the amount of effect a big ship moving like this, moving along, had on the environment. One time the Titanic was going out of Southampton and the New York was moored just to the right of it on its way. And although the Titanic didn't go that close to it, the suction that it caused the New York to suddenly be pulled towards the Titanic to such an extent that all its mooring ropes were broken. And if it wasn't for the quick work with tugs which were in the area, there would have been yet another accident. And when it left Belfast, even before that, there was a crew from Holland & Wolff that were on the ship, and they were actually quite a privileged crew. It was these guys were chosen because they'd been expert in their various fields. The ship sailed, and you can imagine the great excitement of these people who now from Holland & Wolff had this really special journey. But their job actually when going out on the ship was just to check on everything that went wrong and to make notes of it. And Thomas Andrews allegedly didn't socialise at all. He was always in his cabin. People even complained that he was not being as visible as he should be. But he was making notes, he was making drawings, he was making improvements. And bearing in mind, he had not been on the maiden voyage of the Olympic. So this was his first experience in actually sailing in one of these big super ships. And so the time went on. Of course, they weren't at sea for very long before the fateful day came along. And it's, by all accounts, it was he who told the Captain Smith that the hitting of the iceberg was fatal. You can imagine his feelings. I mean, here is a super ship that has been the ambition for Holland & Wolff. He was one of the people who had really pressed to have more lifeboats on the boat. But Pirrie said it would clutter up the upper deck. Allegedly, Alexander Carlyle, the original designer, actually resigned over that decision. So now Andrews knows that the ship is going to sink and there are not enough lifeboats. All that happened afterwards is people saw him in the main lounge area, and he advised them, a young couple, to go to the lifeboats and try and save themselves, which in fact they did. But with that was the last of Thomas Andrews. It was a real devastation for people at Holland & Wolff. However, they did decide to go ahead with the construction of the third ship, the Titanic. There has been all sorts of statements that there was something wrong with the Titanic. People say that the metal was inferior, that the rivets were inferior or badly done. But in fact, people have done intense studies and there was nothing wrong with the Titanic. The Titanic took about 2 or 2.5 hours to sink, and it sank on an even keel. There was no reason for the ship to lean on its side. The water, having got into the ship, went quickly to the other side. If the Titanic had not hit that iceberg and sunk, I wouldn't even be here today talking to you. It's actually, although it was a tragedy at the time, it has given everybody an insight into what life was like and what was going on in those days. 3 things happened which revived the thoughts of the Titanic. The first was the actual finding of the wreck, and the second was the film. And I think it probably was the film that really brought it out into people's imagination. And the third, of course, was the anniversary of the launch of the Titanic. And it was only the last one that actually eventually convinced people in Belfast to build the proper Titanic Museum. There have always been the Titanic societies. I found it amazing that it was in South Africa that someone had actually started making a full-scale model of the Titanic. I mean, bearing in mind, you would have thought this sort of thing would have happened in Belfast or in London or something, but this is now in South Africa. The special thing about the TINTANIC model is that it will be absolutely complete, showing all the insides and all the cabins and everything else. And in that case, it is absolutely